I'm Ali Jackson Jolley. I'm here with Ian Bremmer, who is, of course, a noted political scientist. He is also the founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Ian, welcome, and thanks for being here with us today.
Hi, Alice. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, some really important stuff has been happening in the news, stuff that I wanted to get your input on, and that is increased calls from the world for ceasefire in Gaza. Of course, most notably, earlier, our Vice President Kamala Harris called for a temporary ceasefire. Um, what came to mind? Why is this important, and is a ceasefire likely?
Well, there's a big difference between a temporary ceasefire in response to a deal between Israel and Hamas that will lead to significant numbers of hostages being released. That's something that the whole world is working on and hoping for right now. It's not all that controversial. And a permanent ceasefire, which would end the hostilities on the ground in Gaza. That's something that the Israelis strongly oppose. The Americans continue to oppose, and Hamas is hung up on as part of their negotiating strategy with the Israelis. Now, we'll see if we can cross that bridge. I am hopeful that we will still get to a deal and you will still get 6 weeks of ceasefire. And the hope is that in that period of time, you'll be able to make more progress on further remaining hostages being released, but also in creating a plan for Palestinian self-governance on the ground in Gaza, which of course they do not have right now, and they certainly don't have a path to a state. But I think perhaps the most important thing that's been happening in the last few weeks is that as this war has continued, President Biden has been increasingly and publicly frustrated with the Israeli government, and especially with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that has led the US to start creating some space between them and their principal ally in the Middle East, Israel. That's why Vice President Harris gave the speech that she did. It is also why you've seen the Americans push back forcefully against the prospect of a ground incursion into Rafah, where there are over 1 million Palestinian civilians, but there is no capacity to protect them from those hostilities.
I heard you recently talk about that gaping distance between the view that Israel has that it is not responsible for the 30,000 deaths of Palestinian living in Gaza versus the majority of the world's view that while the terrorism that happened in October was squarely on Hamas's shoulders, these 30,000 deaths are on the shoulders of Israel. Could you speak a bit about that and
Yeah.
give some insight as to whether you think Israel could be more careful about civilian deaths in Gaza?
Well, of course, they could be more careful. I mean, they don't need to have the same level of military engagement that they presently have. They could reduce their targeting to places where they know that there would be less civilian casualties. And to be fair, their effectiveness against Hamas would go down as a consequence. Now, the reason that we know they could do that is because Israel is militarily overwhelmingly more powerful than Hamas. So, I mean, what happened on October 7th was completely unacceptable. It was horrific. It was terrorism. It should be condemned by everybody. But Israel, that happened in part because Israel's own defenses were not being prioritized. They fell asleep at the switch. This is in part the responsibility of the Israeli government for not using effectively their intelligence capabilities their Israeli Defense Force and border security capabilities to make sure that the Israeli people are defended. Israel has a right to defend itself. There's no question. No one should question that. I mean, there are people out there, including Hamas, that believe Israel doesn't have a right to exist. But almost everyone in the world thinks Israel has a right to defend itself. But Israel's right to defend itself not being in question, I mean, they can now ensure that the vast majority of Israeli civilians are protected on a day-to-day basis. Now, Israel's perspective is that those 30,000 plus people that have died, a majority of whom are civilians, and those numbers come from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is under the purview of Hamas, but the US State Department and the United Nations accepts that those numbers are pretty accurate. So we do use those numbers, even though the numbers essentially come from Hamas. That's a caveat. But it's very clear we've had massive numbers of civilians dead. And if anything, there's probably a lot more because you can't figure out who's left under the rubble. The Israeli view is that every one of those deaths are the complete responsibility of Hamas. And they view it that way, first because Hamas engaged in terrorism against Israel, killed over 1,000 Jews in Israel. They're holding hostages. Israel refuses to live in an environment next to a terrorist organization that's committed to the destruction. So they view they have every right to kill those terrorists. And if civilians get caught in the crossfire while they are targeting those terrorists, so be it. Secondly, Hamas, in order to continue to exist militarily, has operated in civilian areas. So Israel's perspective is Hamas is basically holding not only dozens and dozens of Israeli civilians hostage, they're also holding 2 million Palestinians hostage. They're holding those civilians hostage. They steal the aid that comes in, and they operate in tunnels underneath schools and hospitals and residential areas. They want to make it hard for the Israelis to hit them, and if they do hit them, they want the Israelis to have the outrage of the international community from killing these civilians. So Israel's perspective is we try not to kill civilians. We don't target civilians, but maybe there might be some mistakes in the fog of war that can be investigated down the road. But the 30,000 plus people that are dead, that is all on Hamas. Now, very few people in the world outside of Israel accept that argument. Very few people. A majority of Americans, again, completely allied with Israel, provides billions of dollars of military support to Israel every year, but a majority of Americans don't accept that argument. And Biden doesn't accept that argument. He is not calling for a permanent ceasefire. He's prepared to support Israel's efforts to continue to try to end Hamas, and certainly to find and capture or kill their leadership. But he thinks that Israel can do a lot more to help to protect Palestinian civilians. He also thinks that a lot more can and should be done to provide aid for Palestinian civilians, even if a lot of that aid will end up stolen by a terrorist organization. So, I mean, that's a significant gap even between Israel and its principal ally. Now, there are many countries around the world that actually think that Israel is engaged in genocide, in ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people on the ground in Gaza. I mean, when you have the president of Brazil, which is the most important economy and democracy in South America, publicly comparing Israel's war in Gaza to the Holocaust against the Jews by the Nazis, when the Brazilian president does that, that is telling you that Israel is not reading the room, right? That somehow there are lots and lots of countries and people, because I completely disagree with that comparison completely. But Lula was saying publicly what a lot of people are saying privately. And this is a serious problem for Israel.
And do you think that Israel has miscalculated Because I love your use of the term they are not reading the room. Do you think they miscalculated just how this appears to the outside world, including their most staunch ally, the United States? Or do you think it's more like this is what needs to be done? It's okay if we don't have the world support, we're going to move forward. Do you think do you think there's like a disconnect, or is it
Uh,
on purpose?
if this was a decision being made primarily in a cool, calm, collected, and analytic fashion, then I would say the Israelis are severely miscalculated, because long term, I think this is going to hurt them. I think it will radicalize more people. I think it will undermine their position in the international order. I think it will hurt their relationship with the United States, all of those things. But I don't think that's how they're making this decision. This was October 7th was, of course, the worst violence against Jews since the Holocaust, anywhere in the world. And we all said never again. And here it was happening again in the context of enormous amounts of anti-Semitism. And that anti-Semitism continued right after. And we saw it on social media, we saw it on TikTok. And so I think that Israel, which is a country of only 10 million people, facing the deaths of over 1,000 Jews, many of whom were raped, sexually assaulted, tortured, young girls and boys, civilians. This is not an attack on the Israeli military at all. I think that the response to that was emotional, overwhelmingly emotional. The response to that with air raid sirens going off repeatedly all day, all night across the country, waking you up, not knowing what was next, not knowing if you were safe in your beds. I think that it led to an emotional response. I think the reality of hundreds of families who were still out there every day saying, our kids, our family members are there being held hostage by terrorists for months and months, and what are you doing about it? I think that in the context of all of that, the idea of, no, we're not going to send any humanitarian aid to those people, I think that is an emotional response. It's the response of a father whose daughter was raped, and who, is suddenly faced with his killer, is suddenly faced with the criminal, and takes action that is going to lead to horrible consequences that he'll be responsible for. But in the moment, you kind of understand why he feels that way. I think anyone that spends any time in Israel needs to understand this is not just the Israeli prime minister, who is completely unfit to govern and should not be there and should have been thrown out a very long time ago. He's a narcissist. He's pathological. He should be in jail. But the Israeli people agree on that. But across the board, the Israeli population wants this war to continue. This is not left versus right in Israel, and Israel has a lot of political parties. They've got a lot of political debates. They all agree we want Hamas gone. And if that means that innocent Palestinians get caught up in this, well, so be it. Now, I think it is incumbent on us to understand that perspective, not because we have to agree with it, but we need to know what's motivating these people, especially if we ever hope to get to a position of stability and peace, which is, of course, very, very far away right now.
Yeah, and so you use the term that radicalizing, that this response and this prolonged response from Israel could be, in fact, the way I heard it, making the world a little less safe.
Sure.
Is there any way that that genie could be put back in the bottle? So, the US is now calling for a temporary ceasefire. In your view, is there any way that we can, as a world, I guess, creep closer to finding, some level of peace, and in which the people in Gaza and the million Palestinians that you referenced, not becoming more aligned with terrorists because they feel like, that's what needs to happen?
Well, the ceasefire is not going to get you there. The ceasefire is a hope, it is a break, it is a pause, it is a breath. But I don't think 6 weeks in this environment is enough, with the massive hurt and pain, and antagonism that exists right now on the ground. You're not going to get a plan for the Palestinians. It's going to come to fruition for both a political governance solution and a security solution in 6 weeks' time. I don't think that happens. Though, of course, I'm hopeful that we get a ceasefire. Now, longer term, I do think that there are a lot of people in the world that understand that finding a stable solution for the Palestinians is essential. And before October 7th, frankly, that wasn't true. Before October 7th, the Saudis were prepared to normalize relations with Israel and provide like some window dressing for the Palestinians, but they didn't really care. And in fact, the revealed preferences of pretty much everybody in the world, whether we talk about the Americans, the Europeans, the Gulf states, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Israelis themselves, and of course the Palestinians governing the West Bank and Hamas, was that this just isn't a priority. They just weren't focused on ensuring that there was a long-term sustainable deal. And now I think everybody knows that that's what is required. So there is going to be real effort. There'll be political capital, there'll be resources, there'll be money that will go behind finding a way for the Palestinians to live in a way that makes sense, that you would expect that they would accept, in Gaza and the West Bank for the future. I don't think we're months away from that. I think we are at a minimum many years away from that, but you have to start somewhere. That work has to begin. I fear we're not through the worst of it. I fear we're not yet in the rebuilding phase. I think there's still more pain to go, in part because the Israelis do not feel like they are yet close to having disrupted and destroyed Hamas. They don't have any of the leaders. They haven't gotten rid of all the tunnels. There's still lots of military command and control. So this can absolutely and likely will get worse before it gets better, even with American pressure, such as it is, trying to get the Israelis to stop. Also, it is plausible that Netanyahu will be thrown out of office in the coming months. And that will make things a little bit more possible to have a longer term conversation after this war, for what comes next, which would be very hard to do with the sitting Israeli prime minister. But so, yeah, I guess I do have hope long term, but I have no illusions that we are there right now. And of course, when we look at the US political system, this is a problem for Biden. It's a problem for him on the international stage. It's a problem for him in the election. And he is deeply frustrated about that.
Yeah, so a glimmer of a silver lining I heard, but not, certainly no true optimism.
No.
Switching gears a little bit. Again, thinking about what's going on in the Middle East, which is, of course, a always, often, I should say most always, a hotbed. But also the war in Russia and the Ukraine, with Putin making new threats around nuclear retaliation. There's a lot in the news about that doomsday clock and us being closer to so-called midnight, closer to an actual nuclear war than we've been since the 80s and the Cold War. And being a child of the 80s myself, there was nothing more scary than nuclear war. So to be back to that point, has, as it should, many of us very concerned. Could you weigh in? What is your view? Do you agree this is closer than we've been since the Cold War? What do you think?
You know, it's hard to say. It's a this doomsday clock is a little arbitrary in terms of where they set it. I also am a child of the Cold War. In high school, I watched with all of my fellow classmates the movie The Day After. I was terrified. I had nightmares for weeks after that, of what would happen if there was a nuclear holocaust. I think that as kids, growing up in that environment, there was almost an air of inevitability that that was a way you could very plausibly die, incinerated in a fireball, as opposed to slowly of old age. You know, I do think that the Russians, in a period of very serious decline, are still led by someone that is very focused on his survival. And so when he has been pushed, he has backed down. When he threatened, he said if Finland and Sweden join NATO, there are going to be consequences. They join NATO, there have been no consequences. He's been very careful. He invaded Ukraine in 2014 in a small way, and when after many years nobody did anything, then he decided, okay, here's my opportunity to take more. That was careful, and he misjudged not NATO's reaction. NATO didn't do very much in the early days and weeks. He misjudged his own military capabilities because he's corrupt and he doesn't have people around him giving him the right information. He's not managing his country effectively. And when there were possibilities of getting the Poles and other governments involved in the fight, especially through, for example, Ukrainian missile defense that killed a couple Polish farmers in a village right on the other side of the Ukrainian border, Putin was very careful to have his leaders say, no, 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 this wasn't us. So the idea that a nuclear war would start, and the most likely way it would start would be because the Russians would launch a tactical nuke. I don't think there's anyone serious in power today that thinks that that is more likely than it was, in the 80s, in the 70s. I don't believe that. Now, there are other powers with nuclear weapons today than there were in the 80s. You've got the North Koreans, and it's very hard to understand, what is motivating them. There's virtually no transparency or information into that decision-making system. That's a wild card. The Iranians are, within weeks of breakout capability. They've recently reduced their uranium-enriched stockpiles by a little bit. That's useful, but at the end of the day, Iran is, again, much harder to contain and constrain. As a regime, they're much more vulnerable to domestic overthrow than the Russians are. That makes them having nuclear weapons more problematic. Pakistan is another such place where the government really doesn't work. The military is in charge. They have to steal elections that are increasingly implausible. The people are angry. There's a lot of violence as a consequence. They've got nukes. I mean, we shouldn't be comfortable with those things. But, if you were to ask me what's the most likely way we incinerate ourselves going forward, in other words, if you're really looking at downside tail risk scenarios, black swans, if you will, artificial intelligence being used by bad actors in the world in the next 10 years strikes me as a much more plausible way for us to cause immense damage than nuclear weapons. Because I think that the level of proliferation is going to be far greater, and the destructiveness of unintended consequences is also much greater, where there are only still a small number of countries that have nuclear weapons, and they are countries, they are governments, and they are easier to deter and contain as a consequence of that. So on balance, I suppose I'm a little bit less pessimistic than the bulletin of atomic scientists.
Yeah, well, we're out of time. Thank you so much for always delving into these really hard topics, making us just a little bit smarter about the very complex workings of the world. Really appreciate you, Ian, and hope to do it again sometime.
Thank you. Good to see you.